Hello guys, and welcome to another video. In the last video we discussed tattoos and their use case for transcendence in this league and how powerful that keystone is, and in this one we're going to be looking at another timeless keystone, that's Strength of Blood. And Strength of Blood was actually changed in this patch. The old Strength of Blood used to grant 1% less damage taken for every 2% of life recovery per second from Leech, which would mean at a baseline it would grant you 10% less damage taken for the baseline 20% Leech. And you could obviously increase that with sources of maximum total recovery for life Leech. And the new Strength of Blood is essentially working exactly the same, but instead of granting less damage taken, it now grants additional physical damage reduction, but it grants 2% additional physical damage reduction for every 3% life recovery per second from Leech. And whilst this is a weaker stat in general because less damage taken was applying to all the damage you took, this is still quite a significant stat to gain, and additional physical damage reduction is actually quite hard to find these days. It used to be much easier when it was on the passive tree and things like that, but now you've really only got some sources on gear, a few things like aspect of the crab and endurance charges and stuff like that. And this keystone can provide a ridiculous amount of additional physical damage reduction. When combined with one of the new tattoos, that's the tattoo of the Kitava Makanga. I believe that drops from Utala in the final round of the Trial of the Ancestors. And this is a tattoo that grants 80% increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. Now 80% is a ridiculous amount to gain from a single stat here. On the passive tree you can gain 25% on the Leech Mastery. I believe there's another 15% over on the Vitality Void wheel, and then there's a bunch you can gain, I think maybe 30% on Hematophagy, and there's a few other sources of this like Cluster Jewels and things like that. But 80% from a single stat is kind of ridiculous, and this is not limited to one, but it does have a big restricting modifier on there that it requires 7 adjacent passive skills allocated, and it needs to go on a small strength passive, so it is quite restrictive on where it can actually go. Now, if we head over to the passive tree and take a look here, I've actually got a little bit of a loadout for where these tattoos can go. And this is not a build, but you can actually see here what's going on. So, in this slot right here next to Unwavering Stance, you can place the tattoo of the Kitava Makanga, and you can actually place a Warrior's Tail just above it in the jewel slot. And that means you're going to gain 160% increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech, because the Warrior's Tail jewel increases the effect of tattoos in its radius by 100%. And that is one of the slots that you can place this. You can see that we've got 7 connections around here. And if your build does not want to have Unwavering Stance because you want to take advantage of evasion, then you can actually do a nice little trick in this league with that keystone. You can convert this keystone into another keystone using the tattoo which changes keystones, and you could basically change the keystone either into something that's useful for your build or into something that doesn't really impact your build at all. As long as you're allocating this keystone, you can still take advantage of this slot for the tattoo. And you can also place it down here on the middle branch, the one with the 2 stat nodes extending from it. So it can go there as well. It can also go in the slot further down here where the outer dual socket is poking out. That also has 7 connections, and it can go next to the Call to Arms keystone, which also has 7 connections. So there is already 4 slots where you can put it. There's probably a few more that you can put it, but I just wanted to take a look at these because these are actually quite typical pathing nodes for a Slayer, and I want to kind of focus on Slayer a little bit in this particular video because Slayer is probably the best use case for this setup, as Slayer has 2 things going for it. One is Overleech on the Brutal Fervor. That means that Leech doesn't stop at 100% life, so once life is topped off by Leech, the Leech instances remain there and they keep recovering. Every time you get hit, they're going to continue recovering your life. And also, Slayer has 100% increased maximum recovery per life Leech. And that's quite a rare stat. This stat doesn't really exist very many places. And what this is going to do is it's going to increase the base duration of Leech from 5 seconds up to 10 seconds. And if you're using Strength of Blood and Leech as a defensive property against physical damage, and you don't have any other defense against physical damage, then you're going to want long Leech duration, because that means that you have less time to worry about, is my Leech up? and the chances are your leech is going to be up much more often if you have long leech duration. So Slayer is really, really good for this particular use case. Of course, if you don't want to play Slayer, you can do things like Petrified Blood over Leech and things like that. So with the tattoo of the Kitava Makanga, we can actually get a ridiculous amount of Leech going. And in this setup right here, I only have a single tattoo of the Kitava Makanga here, and it's using the Warrior's Tail Jewel, so it's getting double effect. So this is 160% increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. And then we also are using Vaal Pact to double the normal life recovery from Leech, so that's just getting doubled up there. And then we're also using this small wheel here with Vitality Void and the Leech Mastery for 25% increased maximum total life recovery from Leech. And if we take a look at the calcs here, we can actually see our Leech percentage right now. So the base Leech percentage is 20%, and with this setup we have 120%, which means that when we are reaching that 120% maximum Leech with Strength of Blood, we're going to have 80% additional physical damage reduction, which is absolutely ridiculous. 80% from a single keystone, and not really that much investment of stats. As I said, none of this is included here. All of these stats down here at the bottom are not included in the calculation there, but I'm just showing where you could put other tattoos, because you don't have to use this kind of setup here with Warrior's Tail. If you wanted to, you could use 3 tattoos of the Kitava Makanga here in these 3 slots, and then you don't have to invest in any of the Leech Mastery. All you need is Vaal Pact, and then that's it. You're already going to be at 90% additional physical damage reduction. And one of the things with this is you no longer need to run Determination, because you're going to be at the 90% additional physical damage reduction all the time when your Leech is capped out. And because this is additional physical damage reduction and not armor granting the physical damage reduction, it is going to work for bleeding, it is going to work for corrupted blood, and that means that realistically you don't need immunity to corrupted blood, you don't need any kind of defensive measures against bleeding, you probably don't even need a bleed removal flask, because 90% additional physical damage reduction is ridiculous levels of reduction against bleeding. That is not normal at all. I mean, barely any builds ever get anywhere close to 90% additional physical damage reduction anymore. Old Guardian builds used to get there with aura stacking, and old Scion builds used to get there with aura stacking, but these days you don't really see 90% additional physical damage reduction. So you're going to have extreme defense, and one thing I would recommend if you want to go this route is that you make use of the Writhing Jar. That is a unique hybrid flask which spawns some worms, and it's very important to make sure that your Leech is started up and is going before you enter combat. You don't want to jump into combat and get one shot before you have started leeching by some physical damage, because obviously you have no other forms of physical damage reduction. You don't have any armor or anything like that to rely on. This is your complete and whole physical damage reduction. Is coming in from Strength of Blood, which means you want to have a Writhing Jar or 2 in your flask setup, and then whenever you enter a map or whenever you enter a boss arena, you want to make a habit of popping some worms, killing the worms, and then your Leech begins, and your Leech is getting topped off right there, and you're immediately getting up to high levels of additional physical damage reduction, which means you don't have to worry about any physical damage that's coming in from that point onwards. And of course, one of the huge benefits of this setup is that you no longer are reserving that huge chunk of mana for an aura like Determination, and you could instead focus fully on something like Evasion, and you could go for Grace and a setup there, or you could just go all in damage at that point with your aura setup. But yeah, 90% additional physical damage reduction from this kind of setup is absolutely ridiculous. Now, Strength of Blood does of course make your life recovery from Leech no longer apply, and it instead grants the additional physical damage reduction. So that means that you now have a recovery problem, and as a Slayer, your main recovery source is going to be that Leech. So how do you recover your life? Well, there's a couple of ways you can go about doing this. Since you're using Vaal Pact in this setup, you can't consider regeneration as a recovery source. But there is the new Tainted Pact amulet that came into the game. I believe it was last league or the league before. And Tainted Pact is very strong setup with this particular interaction here. Because what happens here is you're playing a build where you're able to hit enemies very often. And let's say you're playing something like Bone Shatter. I'm going to take Khan as an example here because Khan's been using this build last league, and he's using it, I believe, in this league as well. So Khan is playing a Bone Shatter Slayer, and he's using the Tainted Pact. He's got a little bit of poison chance, and he's also got the golden rule, and that means that whenever he poisons an enemy with his Bone Shatter attacks, that poison will be reflected back to the character. And he's playing with a fairly low chaos resistance. I believe he's got around 10% chaos resistance or something like that. And most of the big damage that comes in from chaos damage in this game is damage over time. That's most of the scary damage. Think of the ground puddles in Dell, for example, that are chaos damage over time, or poisons that get inflicted on you. That's damage over time that's dealing chaos damage. There's not that much chaos hit damage in the game, and when there is, you kind of already know about it. Things like the Cirrus abilities, which deal partial chaos damage. But with the golden rule set up along with the Tainted Pact amulet, what's going to happen is you are leeching life, which is the modifier on the Tainted Pact, which states you must be leeching life. And then any chaos damage that you take over time is going to be healing you instead of dealing damage. And that means that when you are inflicting poison on enemies and using the golden rule, those poisons are being reflected back to you, and that poison is now healing you instead of dealing damage to you. And this is really, really nice because you can actually make this setup so that the poison will never be long enough to ever deal damage to you. Your leech will always be there to kind of make sure that your leech doesn't fall off and then the poison starts dealing damage. The poison is going to be shorter than your leech duration, and that means that whenever you have poison on you, either from yourself or from an enemy, it's going to be healing you rather than dealing damage, which is really, really nice, and that's a great setup there to grind yourself some recovery. And of course, you can make sure that you can spec into the Leech Mastery that grants instant Leech, because Strength of Blood only prevents the recovery from Leech that is recovered over time. It does not prevent instant Leech. It specifically states that on the Keystone, life recovery from non-instant Leech is not applied, which means that you can spec into the instant Leech Mastery on the Leech clusters, and then that instant Leech will still be applied as life recovery to you, which is really nice. With that combination there with the Tainted Pact and instant Leech, you'll have no problem at all with recovery, and you can still benefit from the ridiculous amount of additional physical damage reduction granted by Strength of Blood. And I just wanted to kind of make a video on this, as I had received a few comments about people talking about this setup, and I think the new Strength of Blood is quite interesting. I don't think it's as strong, but I think the main reason why they made this change is because Strength of Blood has historically caused GGG a lot of trouble over the years. They've had a problem with it, I think, in 4 separate leagues, where it might be 3 separate leagues, it could be 4 leagues, where basically a build has come out where Strength of Blood, the old Strength of Blood, provided complete and utter damage immunity because particular combinations of mechanics allowed you to gain 100% less damage taken. And with the new Strength of Blood, obviously, you can only reach 90% additional physical damage reduction. That's the maximum physical damage reduction that you can reach. It gets capped out there, and it's no longer going to provide that problem for them. So they're able to add things like the tattoo of the Kitava Makanga, which is nice. And I think I prefer that from the balancing perspective there, where they're allowed to experiment a little bit more with maximum leech modifiers and bring them into the game without the fear of this creating a ridiculous build like that. And that's it for this video, guys. Hopefully this was helpful to shed some light on this setup that you could use with Strength of Blood to provide ridiculous amounts of physical damage reduction. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you to my channel members for your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one.